Time so we could get going. This is great. We have corporate people who are speaking, and they're used to meetings starting on time and ending on time. So this is what we're going to do today. So I'm delighted. My name, for those of you who may not know me, my name is Kathy Dubois. I am the Dean, the Brian Dean of the Miller College of Business. That's my great joy. And I welcome you here today for our. Oh, I'm so sorry. That's okay. I should have something there. This is our fourth. Yeah. Okay. So I welcome you today. This is our fourth Brian Dean Forum. I arrived last year, was my first year here in the Miller College. And this year I am continuing on. The Forum series is part of our Miller College initiative to reimagine business education. That is what we are in the process of doing. And we're doing this to ensure that we prepare our students with future forward knowledge and skills and a sense of purpose, to give them the foundation upon which, and I love this phrase, upon which you will dare to make business decisions throughout your careers that align with our Ball State values. And those values, should those of you not have them all memorized, they are excellence, innovation, courage, I love that one, integrity, inclusiveness, social responsibility, and gratitude. You run a business on those values, you will be successful. So Brian Dean Forum speakers are thought leaders who bring fresh perspectives and insights to us during this event, with the intention that our faculty will infuse these concepts into their teaching moving forward, and our students will be inspired about the possibilities a business career can hold. Today, we welcome speakers from across the globe. Both of them are with EY's New Economy Unit, which is a research and insights team within the EY Global Climate Change and Sustainability Services practice. The New Economy Unit focuses on the long-term systemic shifts toward a new regenerative economy. Anna Roussou, based in Athens, Greece, is the EY Global New Economy Unit Head of Research. And Matt Bell, based in London, Great Britain, is the EY Global Climate Change and Sustainability Services Leader. So these two people are coming to us from Greece and from Great Britain. Through my network of global network of responsible management leaders in higher education, last year I learned of their new economy report last June. And today they will cover some of that report, and they will also be covering their new, just out this month, report. So with that, I want to just do a few housekeeping things. First of all, those of you students who need your ID swiped, that will happen as you exit. We will have a person at each side. I assume that nobody will leave unless you must leave to get to a class on time. And if you need that, then please be respectful and quiet. Remember that we have a reception afterwards. So they will have their PowerPoint. Then we'll have an open Q&A session. And please, we welcome your questions. And then there's this great reception that Tina has set up for us with yummy food. And we will then have an opportunity to talk about what we've heard today and what we're thinking about it. Okay? All right. With that, Anna and Matt, I turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Kathy. And it's a real delight for us to be here, frankly. And super depressing to hear that we won't be joining you for yummy food and reception drinks. So there you go. As you rightly said, we are Matt and Anna. I'm responsible for our global climate change and sustainability practice. So I look after our team globally. We're the largest sustainability consultancy in the world. We've got just over 4,000 people in our practice in around 120 countries. EY operates in around 150 countries globally. And we support our clients, particularly businesses, across the full gamut of sustainability issues, be that climate change, human rights, biodiversity and nature, you name it. We are predominantly made up of people with technical backgrounds. So we have people with scientific and engineering backgrounds, but also increasingly social sciences, business, ethics, psychology, and everything that makes up the cornucopia that is now sustainability. And we've had a team, well, technically we've had a team since the 1980s, but really we've had a comprehensive team for around 25 years. I joined EY back in 2007 in Sydney, Australia, having come from government in the UK where I worked on establishing climate change policy. And all Anna and I do is sustainability work. I'll let Anna introduce herself in a moment, but before I do, Anna took on the role of leading our new economy unit. And the inception of that for me was principally around our concerns that we were seeing from the work we were doing. So as I said, we're the largest consultancy providing sustainability advice to businesses and to governments globally. And we realized that we were actually helping our clients, well-meaning as they were, to drive incrementalism in a world that's running out of time. And we started to see us coming up against planetary limits. We started to see the consequences and the rapid acceleration that we need on action for climate change. And we have more people on Earth today in forms of modern slavery than we have ever had slaves on Earth. According to the ILO, around 49.8 million people on Earth currently living in slave conditions. And so we asked ourselves the question of, what have we achieved, right? And whilst we think we can put our hand on our heart and say we've done some incredible things, it's not enough. And so we wrote an initial report called the Enough Report that actually challenged our community as to whether or not we are doing enough, and if we aren't, what we need to do. And one of the outputs for us was establishing this research team that Anna will give you a bit more insight into in a moment, but really to focus on how we move towards a regenerative new economy and move away from some of the challenges that we have today. And that's what we're going to focus on in our presentation. And as you say, hopefully we will get through it quickly enough to get to some Q&A, because I think that's where the fun will begin. But Anna, introduce yourself and talk a little bit about the NEU.
Thanks, Matt, and thanks everybody for joining us and for having us. It's really a privilege to be speaking to the report today and to be with you virtually. So as Matt mentioned, Anna Roussou, I head up the New Economy Unit. I've come from a fairly lengthy time at EY, although not as long as Matt. I joined in 2016. I've focused my career mainly on climate change and environmental issues, but as it stands at EY, you get an opportunity to get involved in a lot of different things. So a little bit of human rights, a little bit of health and safety, a little bit of everything. But the last year and a half has been the true privilege, because we set up the New Economy Unit with a view to look at the long term of sustainability and the more systemic transformational shifts. We're going to walk you through a number of challenges we're facing today and a number of underlying issues that preclude us from addressing them. So being able to knit these things together and bring them to life for businesses and broader audiences is really just a fascinating part of my role and the stuff we do more broadly in CCAS. So as we mentioned today, we're going to focus on this report that we published in May 2024. We will bring some nuggets from our upcoming report. It's not published just yet, but we're hoping to put it out by the end of the month, which dives deeper into the business lens. The report can be summarized in two diagrams, and we think they speak to wide audiences, but our primary audience, by way of what we do at EY and within CCAS, the climate change and sustainability practice, is businesses. So we want to start by presenting a whole economy view. This was our foundational paper. This was how we defined our vision about what we mean when we say new economy. And those two diagrams basically represent two different models for the present and the future of our global economy. They also act as a table of contents. So if you read the paper afterwards, hopefully you'll see the interconnectivity between the issues, but they also allow you to navigate. And we'll go through them as we go through this presentation. But the format is, at the center, we have outcomes. So on the left, the crises, on the right, the outcomes we want to achieve. On the perimeter, we have the flaws or principles, so the things that kind of guide those outcomes, the lenses through we make decisions and strategy. And on the bottom, and we will not have the time to cover this today because we want to leave time for Q&A, we have 5 key economic actors or forces, as we call them. And those are policy, technology, citizens, finance, and business. And basically, the way that the forces or the actors apply the lenses across the perimeter, is how we get to the outcome, either reinforce them, enable them, or hinder their achievement. So without further ado,
let's get into it. So thanks, Anna. So look, Anna and I went and spoke to a number of people, including some leading economists globally who represent the chief economists of some of the biggest banks, as well as some leading new thinking economists who are driving what we might call post-growth economics. And all of them shared with us their deep concerns that we are either heading towards or already existing within a polycrisis economy. What is a polycrisis economy? It's effectively one where we see multiple crises overlapping and interacting and reinforcing one another to the point at which they are impacting what we might term the real economy, or at least the economy that we measure in real times at a national level and internationally. We show this in this diagram, and we link them as being the geoeconomic crises that we face currently. Whether those are the wars, the risks of international trade, protectionism, or other geocrisis risks that we see, and geopolitical risks, the ecological crises, and we've touched on one being climate change. We know we are woefully heading in the wrong direction away from the objective of reaching a below 2 degree and hopefully a below 1.5 degree future by the end of the century. In fact, according to the UN, we are heading towards 2.7 plus degrees, and maybe even worse if you talk to some of the scientists. But also some of those social crises as well. I mean, I talked about modern slavery risk, which is obviously a pointy end for most businesses, but we also have, deep disparity in the context of, the haves and the have-nots. And it's these crises coming together that are causing significant issues for us in our economy today. Thanks, Anna.
So there's lots of stats in the report, and Matt's already alluded to some of them, but we start by speaking about the ecological crisis that we face. And this is an outlook. The broader challenge is that, as Matt mentioned, across a lot of different spheres, we're heading in the wrong direction. So we've crossed 6 out of 9 of what we call planetary boundaries. And these are the key systems that keep stability across Earth's ecosystems. And one of those crucial ones is climate change. So we know that under current national commitments, we're headed towards 2.7 on average, but closer to 3 degrees Celsius by century end. Contrasting to that is the Paris Agreement, which has committed us to limit temperature increase to 1.5. So we're heading for double that, and that's what scientists call catastrophic climate change. It means that we're putting over a third or nearly a third of species at risk of extinction. It means that we're exposing a significant proportion of the population to unprecedented heat and dangerous conditions, and it means that we're jeopardizing a significant proportion of global GDP. The second lens, as Matt mentioned, is the geoeconomic crises, and these are deeply interlinked with ecological crises, and they reinforce each other. So we're expecting by 2050 to see a significant number of people, over 1 billion, displaced because of natural disasters and ecological threats. The term climate refugees is becoming increasingly mainstream. Adding to that is the exacerbation of conflict. So the World Economic Forum does a risks report every year, and they've identified conflict as a key challenge over the next few years. And we're increasingly seeing severe economic headwinds. So aside from the cost of living crisis, which is exacerbating across a lot of places in the world, we're also seeing global debt balloon. So many of us live in countries where debt payments exceed what governments are able to spend on health and education. Lastly, the social lens. There's a lot of different issues there, but the challenge there is that we're seeing a stagnation in progress across a lot of indicators of social prosperity. We're seeing a significant social polarization as a result of that, as well as the geoeconomic and ecological environment. And we're seeing an increase in inequality when it comes to income and wealth across most advanced economies. So this is very doom and gloom. I promise it's going to get better, but basically a cluster of really challenging, really complex systemic crises that reinforce each other and form that perfect storm in the middle. And we are at risk of locking ourselves in that in the long term.
Can I just linger though briefly? Just go back that one slide. Can I linger slightly on this one? Because I think it's worthwhile saying we often, first of all, these are all measured from a climate perspective in centigrade, and I have no idea what that is in Fahrenheit. 472,000 Fahrenheit. I'm not sure. We're no good at this in Europe. But what it means in reality is that we will see catastrophic, as classified by the scientists, catastrophic climate outcomes by the end of the century. And by the mid-century, we will see devastating impacts at a geographically pervasive level. The sort of hurricanes and cyclones that we're currently seeing will increase in severity, if not increase in number. We will see droughts. We will see deluges of water. The impacts are profound, to the point at which if we head to the worst end of this and things get worse and we're at 4 degrees of warming or beyond, the carrying capacity for humans on Earth could be as few as 1.5 to 2 billion people by the end of the century. Let's just put that in context. That's 1 in 4 people who exist today by the end of the century if we don't address these climate risks. And we sometimes fail to articulate these things as being as systemic and huge as they are, because there is this divide between corporate action and environmental and social outcomes. And even if we start to think about some of those geopolitical consequences in the interlink that Anna talked about, 1 billion human beings displaced being economic migrants because of climate change by the mid-century. Just think about that for a moment. In the next 3 decades, we could see 1 billion people on Earth removed from their homes because of the impacts of climate change. The risks that we see from the polycrisis environment that Anna and I believe we are already in are profound and will impact every nation on Earth, including the rich nations, the OECD. Unfortunately, though, the worst impacts will be felt first by the developing nations. Sorry, Anna, I think sometimes it's just worth us really hammering the point.
That's fair.
So look, we talked about this in the context of the polycrisis. As Anna said, the next stage out for us is to think through, what those drivers are for us ultimately. So in the paper, we advocate for, that the evident lack of progress to address these current sustainability crises is down to 6 systemic flaws, which are the dots that we have on the outside here. And we'll have the opportunity to go through some of those. Let's go to the first one. It's probably the most thorny one, I guess, which is unsustainable growth. This is really where we have ended up with the, if we think about this sort of like over a time frame, from a post-industrial era in the 1880s, where we moved from literal cottage industries towards an industrial revolution, we have increasingly sought growth over anything. Now, this plays out in a number of ways. This is growth at a national level. So many of us, of course, will hear people talking about the need to drive GDP or gross domestic product, and even growth from a corporate level too, and we'll touch on that in a little bit more detail. But from a GDP perspective, some of you may not be aware, we increase GDP at a national level from economic productivity. So organizations and businesses creating more products and selling more products and creating a prosperous society where that economic flow translates into the economy and churns. We also create it though from wars, from building prisons, from building nuclear armaments. Any of these things are also positive GDP displacement activities. And so we in many respects do not measure positive and less sustainable growth. And so we call this out as one of the systemic flaws that exists within our current economic models. Thanks, Anna.
Thanks, man. And one of those, the point that you made is actually one of the 3 key points that we call out, which I'm not going to show on the slide, but it's basically that it's how we define prosperity. We define prosperity in very narrow terms in terms of GDP, and we fail basically consistently to incorporate measures that truly drive well-being or really understand what truly drives well-being. And the worst part of it is that we're doing everything we're doing at great ecological cost. So I'm going to explain those slides, but I'm just going to preface it to say that over the past 50 years, the global population has doubled, but the economy and technology has been a big boost to that. But largely, this is also driven by the fact that we consume a lot more. The economy has more than quadrupled in size, so there's a disproportionate increase. And what that means is we have put an increasing amount of pressure on natural resources, because if we're consuming more, then we need to make more, we need to extract more, there's more pollution, emissions, et cetera. So the challenge that technology has been partially helping us tackle is, well, how do we decouple that growth in GDP from the growth in our environmental impacts? And if you look at the two graphs there at the top, the dotted line or the dashed line shows the growth in GDP in the last 30 years or so. And the solid lines show the growth in carbon dioxide emissions and the growth in material footprint. And these are global. And these lines are not directly touching, which is good. It means that in relative terms, we're growing the economy faster than we're growing emissions and material footprint. But the problem is that we're still growing our impact. We should be reducing our emissions dramatically every year. I'm talking in the range of 7 or 8%, but we're actually still increasing them in absolute terms. And so the problem with decoupling is time. In the time that we have, we are not actually decoupling at the pace and scale. And so that inherently creates a challenge for scientists, economists, researchers when looking at how we define prosperity and how we grow as societies. The second challenge is the societal. So beyond the challenges with actually understanding what contributes to well-being, without due consideration on where the proceeds of growth flow, and that singular focus on GDP, we're seeing, as I mentioned, income and wealth inequality growing too. And this is a really stark statistic. It shows that the richest 10% in the world own 76% of global wealth, whereas the poorest 50% own a mere 2% of global wealth. And this inequality is something we'll bring out in the second flaw that we're looking at, which is overconsumption.
Yeah, thanks. And many of you will have seen the statistics that there are 8 billionaires who have something more, something like 40%, the equivalent of 40% of the wealth of people on Earth, which is amazing. Overconsumption is a linked flaw in the context of unsustainable growth, and it's fueled by unsustainable growth ultimately. Many of you will be familiar with the Earth Overshoot Day, which is a day that is sadly celebrated as something that we need to mark in our calendars. If you went back around 50 years, you'd actually find that our Earth Overshoot Day would have been at the end of December. So we'd largely have consumed within a year what we could replenish in society and environmentally. But unfortunately, as of 2024, it was on the 1st of August, I think, if I get that right, Anna. And that means that we need something like 1.7 Earths in order to sustain Earth at this level, which clearly we can't, right? So we are not existing within planetary limits in terms of our consumptive behaviors. Unfortunately, it isn't even playing out evenly in the context of consumptive patterns, and most of the advanced economies, as I alluded to in introductory comments, are over-consuming more than developing nations. So if we were to all consume at the level of the average of the OECD, for example, we'd need around 3.5 Earths per year to maintain our current consumptive behaviors. And if we were to put that just onto the US, we would need 5 times the planetary requirement to be able to sustain our annual consumption from the US. So clearly it's important because it shows there's a huge imbalance in how global resources are allocated, but most of the consumption, but also most of the waste and ecological impacts are happening across the richest segments of society. Thanks, Anna.
So that's on the consumption side. We then look at the more production side of the issue. And this is where we identify the third flaw, and that's what we call the linear economy. I don't know if you guys are quite familiar with linear and circular economy concepts, but basically it means that we have a take, make, waste model of producing things, which means we extract materials from the earth. We make something with a view that it will be used once, or that at the end of the life, it'll end up as waste. We don't have that cyclical view where inputs end back into the loop. And so the first statistic there shows that around 7% of material that enters our economy actually comes from secondary sources, so it's the recycling. That means that over 90% of what we extract from the earth to produce our goods and services is only really used once, and then either locked into infrastructure or ending up as waste. And because of the increase in demand for goods and services over time, we have tripled the global rate of resource extraction since the 1970s. And if we continue down the same path, we will double it again compared to today in 2060. So this is a massive problem because we're already using 1.7 Earths. This is, aside from the challenge that this creates in terms of sourcing the materials, it creates huge waste challenges, and it's the key driver of pollution, of water stress, biodiversity loss, and global greenhouse gases. Because resources are very locally concentrated, so let's think of a mine, for example, where it is in the world, or forests, or even water resources, they create a lot of local challenges as well. They're often located in countries that have poorer infrastructure to manage these challenges, and even poorer governance structures in order to address issues like corruption. So we're seeing displacement of local populations, human rights violations, alongside ecological challenges at the local level. And again, going back to the geoeconomic crisis, we are putting ourselves in an age of scarcity where geoeconomic competition, so the competition for land and water and critical minerals, which are very key to addressing climate change, for example, are causing a race for resources and causing a lot of tension between countries, which I'm sure you have been experiencing in the news.
Thanks, Anna. And like, there's a link here from the linear economy to the next, which is really, this context of myopia from the financial capital markets. And if we think about this, I mean, Anna articulated, we take resources to make something, we sell that something to someone who consumes it. There is a waste product that then gets dealt with in a very linear fashion. And that's because our economic models incentivize that. Largely, we're seeking to grow organizations and get an increased shareholder return from this increased access to selling a product or service. And what it's led to, of course, is a myopia or a short-sightedness in the financial capital markets. So the rewards structure is driving organizations. Connected to that, Anna, of course, is our short-termism as well. Short-termism in the context of organizations and how they think about their business strategies. So if you are rewarded from the financial capital markets in the context of your share value driving the behaviors that are short-termist, so too are the management decisions that are made. Quarterly returns, for example, by their nature, drive short-termism within businesses. And on top of that, most businesses look at risk management over a 1 to 2 year period, and they look at a business strategy on 2 to 4 years, sometimes as an outside 5 years. But a lot of the issues that we've been talking about up front here are multi-decadal issues that need to be dealt with now and at some cost, even though the benefits are going to be shared across all of society over a longer period of time. There's this imbalance in terms of the myopia of financial markets between where the benefactors are in the longer term and the benefactors in the short term, and that's playing out in short-termism too. Anna, is there anything else that I've missed from this?
No, that's great. I think a financial capital myopia ultimately is our failure to value things other than whatever has a dollar value to it. And in part, it's very challenging to do so, but it also stops us, even though we know what we do is detrimental. The fact that we can't account for it, we do a lot of accounting at EY, so this is close to our heart, is an oxymoron. Like we can't measure it, but we know it's bad, we still do it. And then the short-term element is very closely linked to financial capital myopia. And it's cognitive as well, right? So if you think about how we as people operate in our lives, we tend to normalize things that happen over long periods of time, such that creeping long-term crises like climate change, for example, get normalized. There's a lot of studies on extreme weather events and how we tend to think less of them in a 5-year time scale.
Yeah, and those of you in the audience who are studying economics or have economics as part of your business degrees or whatever else you might be studying will recognize the terminology of externalities. So those elements that have an impact on a business directly or indirectly, or an impact on society that aren't priced. And many of the unpriced externalities, such as climate change, so the emissions associated with business activity, or the utility of people and workforces in a way which is unfair, unstable, or unjust. All of those are externalities that are priced into society, and so we often as taxpayers pay for that, but the businesses themselves don't have to, and so it drives that unsustainable business model over time.
And that brings us to our last flaw, which is siloed thinking. And so this
we do get more positive at some point, by the way. It's not all doom and gloom.
The last doom and gloom. Gonna get all brighter now, literally. So siloed thinking is very closely linked to financial capital myopia and short-termism. Think of the first three flaws more as the kind of mechanical elements, and then the other ones are more theoretical around how we make decisions. So siloed approaches, both in terms of how we look at issues and solutions, but siloed approaches also in terms of how we work towards solving things. And the diagram on the screen is quite busy, I realize, but the simpler version of it is a diagram that was called carbon tunnel vision, which basically said, even when we look at environmental issues, we tend to just look at climate change. We look at the issue of carbon emissions in its isolation, and therefore we identify solutions and tactics that don't necessarily look at nature decline and inequality. We put in place policies that may lead to inequitable outcomes, or that may even lead to trade-offs between addressing climate change and addressing biodiversity loss. For example, there's tensions between growing crops for fuel versus growing crops for food. And so these two elements need to be looked at the same time. And then the approaches are also disjointed. So global collaboration is really key to addressing all of these crises, both at the international policy, but also the business level. But we still tend to work in relative silos. Even within the businesses themselves, the sustainability function is slow to be integrated into the broader business strategies. However, there is a more positive way to look at this. My face just turned really white on the camera. So we advocate in our research that transitioning to a new economy is actually still possible if we act quickly and decisively. And here is how we articulate that new economy. At the center, as I mentioned at the start, we have the outcomes. So a new economy, a regenerative economy, is one with planetary and human flourishing as interlinked objectives at its very heart. How do we achieve that? Through the decision-making of policymakers, the technology development, the citizen choices that we make, how we finance things, and how we work as businesses, using 5 core principles. And those 5 principles are there to replace the flaws and address the challenges that they pose. So as we're going through the next few slides, we'll talk about the key shifts that each principle entails, but also bring to life a little bit the role of business, which links to the research piece that we're working on publishing now. And that's your favorite, so I'll let you go through it.
Yeah, thanks. So we'll start off with sufficiency, which is probably the pointiest of the principles that we came up with in terms of, what would need to be addressed for us to head towards a new regenerative economy. Most traditional mechanisms of thinking about sustainability, and certainly corporate sustainability over the last couple of decades, has kind of been focused on making things we do less bad. Making them less environmentally impactful, or more socially just, rather than actually making them sustainable. And it was the Brundtland report that originally termed the phrase sustainable development. Meeting the needs of today without impacting on the needs of future generations or hindering them in any way. And so the first principle for us is sufficiency, which we've termed as seeking enough for a good life within planetary boundaries. This concept of, if we breach planetary boundaries, we cannot have enough for ourselves and for future generations. And so let's redefine what a good life is. So sufficiency is directly linked to demand side management, consumption, effectively. And it's about rethinking how we meet those societal needs in an optimal way. So a couple of things. It's about addressing and avoiding unnecessary or excessive consumption patterns and shifting them as well. When we tend to think about sufficiency, or as some people have coined it, degrowth, although we've deliberately not done that because we don't think that's actually a very smart mechanism of being able to talk about what we are here. Really what we're talking about is the ability to change the way that we do things and change the value structure that we have from business values. And sufficiency doesn't mean that consumers are going to be worse off, which tends to be the rhetoric that we hear in the marketplace. In fact, research shows that sufficiency-based approaches, so let's take, for example, something like replacing car travel with public transport or cycling or walking, switching to more of a plant-based diet, they don't just yield environmental and social benefits, but they actually improve well-being overall. Whether that's, in the case of diet changes, reducing obesity, or in the case of vehicles, improving air quality, increasing time outdoors. For example, measurements in the US have shown that schools, for junior schools that are nearer to highways, have a worse impact on the health of those children and their ability to learn than people who are further away from those highways. So addressing some of these sufficiency challenges actually have well-being benefits far outweighing and far beyond the economic gains that might be gained from our current modes of operating. Anna.
So the role of business. So those two points that Matt outlined are basically the shifts that need to happen. And so there are a couple of enablers, a couple of levers that businesses have in their hands. The first one is around creating the motivation for change. So this is all about promoting positive narratives, raising awareness around sustainable lifestyles. And many of you will be familiar with the brand Patagonia, which we mentioned in our latest paper. And they've been very vocal around getting people to buy less of their own product, getting people to repair the product, to buy for life. They've even launched campaigns, I don't know if you'd seen it, called Don't Buy This Jacket, encouraging people to to choose more sustainably. The second lever is all about being able to change. So if you want to choose more sustainable lifestyles, having the capacity to make that change. And that's where businesses can create choice by offering more sustainable products and by making those choices affordable and easy for the consumers to pick over the unsustainable option. And an example that's a bit more mainstream there is one of Procter & Gamble that we also mentioned in our paper, in their cold wash detergent, which they market as doing the same job as a hot wash detergent, but also one that saves you energy and saves you cost. So it's an incentive for a consumer to use that. Moving to
Thanks,
next.
Alan. Let's go. So we talked about linear business models. Well, what's the alternative to a linear model? It's a circular one. And this is, at its core, it's about making, products that take as little from the natural environment as possible and treating waste as a valuable resource. But it's really trying to create as little waste within the economic cycle as you possibly can. That in many ways has been an area that people have focused on the waste side of things, so how you utilize and use waste products. But actually, it does connect back into the sufficiency conversation that we were just having, which is really to say, well, we should be redesigning up front to ensure that we are looking at the business models overall. Is it actually that the linear model we have at the moment is unsustainable and we could move towards a completely different, more circular model? Let's take, for example, service-based models. If we think about, our old blockbuster movie example where we all went and bought and rented DVDs, we now have access to streaming services. And so whilst there are still challenges associated with some of those business models, the mere fact of us reducing the amount of the consumptive behavior of plastics and all of the other chemicals and processes required in us having a physical product in our home has by nature changed the linear to a much more circular model. Lastly, it's also about addressing both scarcity and environmental pressures from material extraction. So, products need to be made to cycle as many times as possible, which means looking at different modes of production and the different uses of primary materials, but also in things like agriculture and forestry products, selecting materials that can be recycled multiple times without degrading. So by their nature, you need to produce less of the raw material in order to generate and maximize the amount of the products that you're manufacturing over time.
So two levers for business here as well. The first one is all about circularity by design. So at the moment, we focus most of the approaches at minimizing the recycling waste. So they end up at the tail end of the waste hierarchy. But the really innovative businesses are looking at the very start of the life cycle of a product. And so they're looking at how they can actually design a product that is going to be as circular, as modular as possible. And two examples that we bring to life in our research paper involve Shift and Fairphone. They both produce mobile devices, and they're both modular. You can remove the screen, you can remove the batteries. They offer DIY guides and kind of customer support on how to service your phone. So their whole model, the whole design of their product, the proposition, is built on being able to make it last and being able to change parts without necessarily changing the whole thing. The second lever is all about system-wide innovation. And so this is really critical in a circular economy where we need to create markets for circular products. We need the right policy and infrastructure. We need ways to make secondary materials more attractive and more available, because at the moment they tend to come at a premium. And moving to these approaches is actually very economically beneficial from a global economy, but also has proven to be very economically beneficial for businesses that choose to shift to these approaches.
Thanks, Anna. Let's move on to systems thinking. So again, Anna touched on this earlier on in the context of thinking through a very clear tunnel vision when you're thinking about issues. And she gave the example from climate change. And it's an interesting one because, of course, businesses often tend to think about the maximization of returns to shareholders through, maximizing their production systems, improving efficiencies, expanding out their customer base. And they can be quite singular in their view of how they get to that end. And there are these externalities that we've already talked about not being priced in or factored into those decision making. So too can be the case when people are looking at dealing with some of those externalities. And Anna talked you through that from climate change. What we actually need, because of the interconnected nature of the fact that our businesses operate within society, which operates within the environment, is actually to take a systems thinking view, considering how each of those things interrelate and interlock, and including those within our decision making when we think through our production cycles and even our overarching business models. In the paper that you've been touching on, Anna, we use the example of an auto manufacturer to bring some of those to life. An internal combustion engine car, GHG emissions from burning petrol or diesel may seem like the obvious issue, but if you look at mobility as a whole, traffic congestion, air quality, materials use, emerge as equally important and directly related issues. Similarly, for manufacturers looking to address the emissions of their petrol vehicles, the obvious choice is to replace with an EV. But from a whole of mobility point of view, improving public transport, creating cycling lanes, developing smart traffic systems, they're all part of a suite of solutions that address issues in the mobility system or, across the board. So whilst we would tend to think about a point solution to an issue which might solve the specific issue you're thinking of, we believe taking a systems thinking view is going to be much more necessary. We know that 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries, as measured by the Rockstrom Institute, have already been breached. But it's only really climate that we see really being focused on by businesses, probably at the expense of many of these others. And the interlocking and the interrelated nature of those means that were we to lose some key biodiversity aspects or some social part of our economy, that may well impact on the others anyway. And I'm not sure I've covered that well enough, but add to it, please.
You did, and I'll cover the last bit a little bit more now. So two levers, the pattern here for businesses. So businesses already do, mapping of their stakeholders, of their supply chains. So it's critical that we move one step beyond that, and for us to understand where we sit within an ecosystem. So looking at the broader network that a business operates within, and understanding the different nodes that make up that system, where there are dependencies, where there are interconnectivities, and therefore where there are points of intervention. So where we can create those positive feedback loops that will accelerate momentum for transformation. The second lever is all about cross-system engagement. So very similarly to circularity, taking a systemic approach requires us to graduate from working in silos and individual businesses and looking at solutions as clusters, working with multiple partners across the value chain, and mobilizing the whole ecosystem to pursue joint initiatives. And we have a great example of that again in both of the papers actually that were make up our research so far, which is that of Kalundborg symbiosis, which I'm sure not many of you have heard, but it's basically an industrial symbiosis project in Denmark, in Kalundborg, where you've got 18, I think at the moment, public and private organizations that both co-locate but also collaborate to share knowledge and resources. And at the industrial scale, that means that waste from one plant, let's say, becomes an input to another, and this saves them a lot of money. It saves water, it saves carbon emissions, so it has really big financial benefits and really big environmental benefits, and it's become one of those really shining examples of how you can actually create this interconnectivity and work within an ecosystem of partners to achieve really good circular solutions.
Thanks, Anna. Let's touch on value redefined now. This is a little bit more of a complex one to explain, but it's really foundational because value redefined for us is intended to try and balance the issues that we have on short-term fixation on the financial. At the core of the issue lies really a rethink of the theory of value, and it's pretty relevant in terms of what we teach in economics and business schools, as our definition of value tends to be built on manufactured or financial capital flows and tend to do pretty poorly in considering stocks and flows of other forms of capital. Again, don't forget, this is framed in the context of planetary limits, which, if breached, collapse, and comes from very much this issue that we call the challenge of the commons. The commons in the UK were common land where people were allowed to graze their livestock. And if each individual grazed a single livestock, the common lands would be fine, right? But ultimately, if we move to the point at which everybody overgrazes, then those lands erode and no one gets anything and no one is producing milk. And the challenge is that each individual business is not necessarily working within this new definition of where value is created. So at a country level, I talked about GDP, and some countries are starting to think through how they can redefine prosperity. For example, New Zealand and Bhutan are good examples that have already taken steps to change how they define and measure prosperity. We've got the happiness index as an example where people are measuring well-being and moving beyond just GDP as a measure of success at a country level. And if you open any sustainability report of a corporate, you're going to see a lot of metrics around how much water is used, or how much waste is recycled, or emissions are avoided. But what you won't see is the context in which those numbers exist, how they're measured and how they're disclosed. So understanding how much water a company consumes compared to the carrying capacity of the watershed it operates in, or how much emissions performance compares to the global climate target that it will be critical to. This means we need to shift the context, science-aligned measures of value that convey performance against planetary and social thresholds, or any objective.
And in fact, we have a lot of that already in place. There is no shortage of approaches and methodologies to account for different forms of capital, to attribute context. The problem is that we have not been successful in incorporating that in a comprehensive way in how we account for value, as I mentioned earlier. So what we're missing really is standardization of the many existing approaches, suitable regulation to enable consistent adoption across the corporate world, but also nationally. The second, and I guess slightly thornier challenge, is redefining how we make decisions. So redefining value and governance. And this is all about the concept of inward and outward materiality, which you may not have heard, but this idea of looking inward in a business. So how's the business impacted by all these crises, and how do we kind of safeguard the longevity of the business, to outward, which is increasingly being incorporated in EU law, for example. How do you look at the impacts that the business has on various shareholders? So in our latest paper, we look at different governance models, and you may have heard of B Corps as an initiative that looks to really kind of redefine impact measurement, but also redefine the role of creating benefit for other shareholders and how businesses govern themselves, which is very, very interesting.
Thanks, Anna. Let's finish off then with the last one, which is equity and justice. By naming convention, that probably makes a lot of sense to many of you. But actually, when we think about it, it's supposed to cover a number of areas. Really, there is an obligation for organizations to think through the full value chain that they operate within, ensure that they are making equitable and just decisions around those. And I think you'll talk a little bit about living wage in a moment as an example of that within your supply chain of any company. But you might be familiar with terms like just transition. How do we transition our economies at a global scale towards a net zero economy where we aren't reliant on emissions to generate prosperity, but do that in a way where people aren't left behind, whether those are industry sectors or individuals operating within an environment where they are associated with very, emissions intensive activities, or just because, they are organizations which are going to have to go through massive, rapid transformations in their industry sector and need retooling and re-equipping so that the people will be well placed for those new jobs. Secondly, this shift has been particularly prominent in the global biodiversity summits, but the knowledge and contribution of different stakeholders, including those of indigenous peoples and local communities, is going to be critical in crafting solutions that are fair and will work at the local level. We've seen many business models which are ignorant of those processes and have either exploited individuals from the First Nations or indigenous communities, or have failed to see the benefit of some of their traditional methods of existing within the planetary limits of the communities in which they operate. Third, there is this need to mainstream the notion of global commons, which I touched on. The atmosphere, oceans, and land-based ecosystems are shared. And what we do in one part of the world will have a equal and dramatic impact globally. And so we do need to make sure that we are being equitable and just at a global level. And any one individual organization doesn't say we'll be okay as long as everybody else decarbonizes or everybody else addresses these social issues or deals with biodiversity loss, we'll be fine. That won't be possible if you're following this principle. Anna, some examples?
Yes, and I think this will lead us to the last slide. So we'll have a little bit of time left for Q&A. So 3 levers for this one. The first one is empowered participation. So really inviting the perspective of multiple diverse stakeholders beyond shareholders in decision-making processes within businesses. The second is all about distributing governance. So at the moment, everything happens in a very centralized way. But research shows that local solutions tend to be very effective. So those that are led by the communities, let's say, that they are intending to influence. And then the last one is all about removing structural barriers. And that's where, Matt, you mentioned the living wage initiative. So thinking about beyond the operations of a business into the value chain, about fair compensation, about human rights, and how a business can change its own practices, but also advocate for the right policy conditions, the right reforms in order to address things that are perpetuating, I guess, inequality and injustice. And again, this brings me back to the different governance models that we've seen. We talk a lot in the paper around cooperatives, really successful organizations, some of which are quite sizable and you'll all know about, that have found ways to distribute governance, distribute decision-making, democratize it in a sense, and have become actually very successful in doing so, both financially, but also from a broader societal and environmental perspective. And with this, I think we'll close.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. I mean, I think we'll move to a Q&A. I would make a comment, though, actually, that it was beautiful to hear the values from Ball State University, because I think if you hopefully reflected on some of the principles we talked about, you'll see some reflections on the values that you have within the university yourself. And I love the opening comment. If you can apply those, hopefully you'll be driving sustainable businesses. I think that's very true. Hopefully what we want to try and present, though, from this paper is that we have a choice, right? We can continue to maintain our current business as usual processes, procedures, structural norms, societal expectations on consumptive behavior, and we will head towards an increasingly, destructive environment that's worse for everybody for us, let alone the next generation. Or we do have a choice to actually head towards a more regenerative economy, one where nature thrives and we can still prosper as well if we measure prosperity in a slightly different way. So we finished with the question of, which of these futures do you wish to gift to future generations? But the reality is that many of you will be existing within those future generations within your working life. And you have the opportunity to make the sensible changes that we think we would encourage for us to head in the right direction. And with that, happy to take any questions you like.
Questions? Who wants to start?
EY uses the tagline, building a better working world. What does this mean to EY employees and to customers?
I can start with that, and then Anna, you can give your reflections on what it means to you, I guess. But we came up with the tagline of building a better working world 13 years ago, interestingly, largely because our practice had built something called the purpose-led transformation methodology, where we recognized that businesses were actually often without a purpose. They didn't really understand what they were there for, other than generating shareholder returns. And so we recognized that in order for businesses to be better, that we would have to ensure that we're building in environmental and social principles to the work that we deliver. What it means to our people is hopefully that they can think about the work that they do, whether they're providing tax advice, they're helping organizations go through major transactions, or even, we're helping companies to audit how they are performing on an annual basis. And we take a slightly wider lens to that. So we aren't just thinking about financial performance, we're thinking about the broader context. Anna, is that how you see it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a fairly easy one for me and the job that we're doing, because it is all about helping businesses build a better world at the end of the day. And that's by helping them incorporate sustainability considerations, whether that is compliance, whether that is strategy, but ultimately it's also about challenging them. And this is exactly what we're doing in the unit, and we're doing with these reports. So it's definitely something that we feel quite strongly.
Okay, who's next?
I know that this focuses a lot on the business level and the business side of things, but how can we start to make a difference as individuals?
That's a really good question. So I think all of the aspects that we actually cover in the paper also apply to people as individuals. So if you look at sufficiency, for example, it's all about consumer choices. It's all about thinking how much is enough for me to be happy within the limits of the planet. How can I adopt more sustainable lifestyles? What are the choices that will enable me to do that from a product perspective? If you look at circularity, it's all about thinking about where the products that we purchase come from. How do we shift to more service-based systems? So there's a lot of messages that are very much applicable to individuals, but I'd say there's certain things that will be very easy to do and certain things that will be really challenging. So each person, it doesn't mean that we all have to kind of stop flying everywhere or make really radical changes. But I'd say start with thinking quite carefully around consumption choices. For me as a consumer, this is the number one thing that I think about a lot more carefully over the time that I've been working in sustainability.
Look, we didn't touch on the forces, and actually, one of the forces is policy, policy that sets the right enabling environment for businesses to change. And we do think we need to have policy reform for this, because it shouldn't just be up to individual behavioral choices, because that won't be enough, frankly, for us to make the change. And in some countries, we see, those market failures addressed. I was in New York for the last couple of weeks, and I was super surprised to be given a plastic straw. I haven't had a plastic straw in Asia or Europe for, I don't know, Anna, 12, 15 years. And it's a small example of a product that we'll use for normally less than 1 minute, that we get the raw materials from 2 kilometers below the ocean floor, and then takes 4,000 years to degrade in landmass. I mean, that, if you think about that as a linear business model, you go, why the hell are we using plastic straws? But it's a tiny part of the equation. And, plastic bags and straws make up less than 0.03% of plastic waste globally. So we need to do more than that. But we can make conscious decisions. And actually, Anna shared some really interesting social research that says, from a total population of people, if we get to, and I'm going to get this wrong, 3.5% of a population that changes their behaviors, the entire population will move, because it will drive policy change. It will drive, changes in customer demand, and therefore how businesses respond. And that's what we've seen with things like plant-based diets, which are, much more heavily adopted in some countries than others. The uptake of electric vehicles, say Norway, for example, 97% now of all vehicles sold are EV. And a lot of that has been driven by customer demand and changes by individuals saying it's not good enough. We want a better choice.
Great.
The short answer is fly less and eat less beef. There we go. There's your 2 choices to start off with. Say no to your plastic straw.
Do you think it will take the government, nonprofit, and business sectors all working together to make substantial change?
Yeah, it's a good question, you see. So I think the question was, will it take not-for-profits, business, and governments to work together? Yeah, I mean, there's something called the Sustainable Development Goals, which followed on from prior goals. And they basically say that by 2030, we should try and address 16 substantial challenges, be that life below the water, climate change, equity, gender equity, and then the 17th goal, which is to partner to achieve them. And what it says is that civil society, governments, and business need to come together to achieve those goals, because unless we do all of those things, we cannot change within the time frame that we need to. Interestingly, we're starting to see this being brought in now in some of these international conversations. So there's a group of international what are they called, Anna? I mean, our conference of parties, the international negotiators who come together at a country level for climate change and for biodiversity. There is a third one, but I won't bore you with it. But for biodiversity and nature, we're now at the 16th COP coming up in Cali in Colombia in the next few weeks. And last year in the 15th COP, it was the very first time that they'd set a target for business. So all of the multilateral negotiations that had occurred, which are quite substantial, had been for governments to put in place to affect change. But there's a real recognition, actually, if business doesn't change, then there's going to be a push for business as usual at the national level, and they won't achieve their international objectives. So yeah, it's a good question.
One more in the back.
And do shout at the back. It's hard to hear.
Can you hear me from here?
Louder.
Okay. So you mentioned local communities working with sustainability groups.
Louder.
Louder? Okay. You mentioned local communities working with sustainability groups to increase sustainability across the world. If I could mention one example with that in my own life. The area where I grew up in, it's about 200 square miles of farmland in small towns, country people. And about 5 years back, this sustainability group came in and they told everyone that they wanted to build a solar plant there in order to replace the natural gas plant. Well, the local people there hated the idea because they were worried that if that solar plant got built, it would force many families to sell their farms to make room with it. And as the solar plant expanded, more farms would have to be sold off. And so the local people went to the local government about this, and in the end, they actually ended up voting to ban the solar farm from building in that area. And so I agree with the importance of local communities working with sustainability firms in order to promote sustainability. But at the same time, there's also some communities that will push against sustainability if it hinders their local culture or their local community.
Yeah, look, and also we're talking about really big changes, right? And some of those are very hard for people to be able to accept, particularly when they change your way of working in your day-to-day life. We actually did some work in Australia, a really interesting project where we worked with local communities on a changed process around how wind farms could be developed. And we set an obligation working with government that if you were looking to develop a wind farm within certain regions of Australia, you actually had to make sure that the local community were part owners of the wind farm. Now they were gifted that as part of access rights and being able to put these windmills effectively on their land. And we tracked them over a number of years. And what was fascinating was we had a little bit of something called NIMBYism. You know what NIMBYism is? It's not in my backyard, where people were kind of like, we want solar panels and wind farms for sure, just we don't want them in here. We put them somewhere else. But actually, this process whereby they could kind of go, well, not only is there a payment for building these wind farms, you actually then have an annuity base that comes back into the community. So all the local community make a profit share off these businesses in a way that the communities were not making a profit share from the resource companies that existed prior. They were extracting at the time, actually, where we were looking, they were extracting coal. None of that went to the local community. They had no royalties locally, but the wind farms they did. And we tracked it for a number of years, and we tracked it because we were looking at the stickiness of money. And what that means is we were looking to see how much of the revenue that was generated would actually remain within the community. And phenomenally, it's the most sticky revenue and money we've ever been able to track inside EY, because they felt it was their money and it should stay in their community. So not only did we start to see much more of an acceptance of the sort of project that was rejected where you come from. It's a super sad story, by the way. But they were also using that money locally, and more local businesses started to shoot up. So there was this micro economy and a sharing economy which came about, and greater connectivity between the locals who didn't know one another because they were all sharing in the co-benefits of something they all felt owners of. And it's these kind of business models which we've never really seen before, because we've had organizations that have come in and exploited natural resources for the benefit of society. But actually in these change models, society themselves can be co-benefactors in these kind of activities. And you could see the same for a solar farm, right?
We are now at 4 o'clock, a little bit after. So thank you so very much. I am so appreciative of your time.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
And I will also circulate the web addresses for your reports. So that
We'll be checking up with individuals to make sure they've read it. Thanks,
thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
See you.
Bye.